Welcome to LA FOIP in the classroom. 10 questions you should ask before you release student information. LA FOIP is the Local Authority, Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act of Saskatchewan. It is the legislation that governs school divisions with regard to privacy and access in Saskatchewan schools. The first question to ask yourself when considering the release of student information is whether or not the record in question is personal information. This is important because the release of personal information is restricted under LA FOIP. A record contains personal information if it contains the information about who the student is. Facts such as race, religion, creed, whether or not the student has a disability are all part of who the person is. What the person does is also considered personal information. This specifically includes education. Therefore, most, if not all, records of a student would be considered personal information. Opinions and views about the student are also personal information of the student. Question number 2 asks whether or not you know what board policy or procedures are required with regard to the release of personal information. Knowing and following policies and procedures is crucial. They set the minimum standard of care that will be looked at by courts to determine if the school division acted properly. Failure to follow policies could result in legal liability for the board. In cases where a staff member knew or ought to have known what the policy was and then failed to follow it, disciplinary action might be a possibility. Question number 3 to ask yourself before releasing information is whether or not you have authority under the policy to release the information. In some cases, the policy itself will set out who can release certain types of information. In some cases, you will be directed to do so by a supervisor or as part of your duties. In cases where it is unclear, it is best to check with a supervisor before releasing the information. Question number 4 asks you to consider whether or not the record that might be released contains the personal information of any other parties. This could be information about another student or another parent. For example, releasing the address or phone number of a student may reveal the parent's number to an estranged spouse. When information of other parties is contained in a record, that information must be removed from the record before the record is released. This can be done by blacking out paper documents, by blurring video, or by removing it by other technological means. Question number 5 asks who might be able to view the information if it is shared. This is especially relevant where information might be posted, such as on a school data wall or on the school's website, or sent by email to another partner school. In cases where personal information, such as photos or names of students, might be displayed, the disclosure is always subject to LA FOIP. The personal information should not be disclosed unless there is consent. Question number 6 follows on from the previous question. If the information will be viewed by the public, then the question to ask is whether or not you have written consent to share the information. In most cases, The school division media consent will provide the consent needed for most situations. If it does not, then an individual consent can be obtained. Question 7 asks, do you understand the terms and conditions of the contracts for the programs or app being used by students? Many sites gather personal information or data to identify students. In addition, all information created by students and posted to the sites is also personal information of the students. Many sites retain the right of ownership to materials posted. In some cases, they even share or sell data. Even if they don't, you need to understand what kind of security is in place and whether or not you can ever be sure that such data will be deleted. The school division is responsible for supervising students while using and accessing the internet at school, and will be liable for any damages that flow from the misuse of student information. Question 8 deals with a demand for information from an individual. Before deciding what should or should not be released, you need to ask if the person making the request has the legal authority to do so. Parents must have either custody or access of the student in order to access the personal information of the student. Guardians will not always have formal paperwork, and it would be advisable to check with your supervisor if there is any question. Information should be shared only with those staff members who need the information to do their jobs. Third parties do not have any right to information unless they have some legal authority that is recognized under LA FOIP. Third parties include the Ministry of Education, the police, and social services. If the person making a request does not have authority, ask yourself whether or not you have written consent to release the information. Consent will allow the release of information as long as it is in writing and is informed consent. When students are of mature age, usually high school, the consent of the student should be obtained as well. Question 10 asks whether or not the privacy interests of the student will be interfered with. This should always be the final filter before any student information is released. If the release will interfere with the privacy right of the student, then the information should not be released. This applies to the release of information to parents and to third parties such as the police. It even applies to the courts. The judge will determine whether or not the privacy interests of the student will outweigh the relevance of using the information in a court case. Finally, and this is not so much a question as an exception, you should ask whether or not there is an immediate safety risk that could be prevented by the release of the information. If there is an immediate safety risk, then the safety issues will outweigh the privacy interest and the information should be released. If you have any further questions concerning the release of student information under LA FOIP, please contact your superintendent or the school division's LA FOIP coordinator. You can also obtain further information on this and other privacy and access issues at saskschoolprivacies.com.